Okay, we are live. This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joseph Cohen from Queens College in the City University of New York. Today from my office instead of my studio. And we're going to be talking today about teaching rural students. You know, so much of the academy is focused on the urban and the suburban experience, including those secluded bubbles where urbanites go to luxuriate amid the mountains and lakes as a college resort. No, today we're talking about rural students, regular, non-rich people from rural communities in search of higher education. How do we teach them? Are we teaching well? Well, today we're going to talk to two scholars who spent a lot of time thinking about how to serve these students. And they're working on books that are part of a series published by Lexington, Urban Rural Dynamics, edited by Alex Thomas and Greg Fokerson of SUNY Oneota. First, Casey Jakubowski. He's an interdisciplinary social science scholar at the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. He wrote an interesting article, Urban Normative Reforms Missing the Mark, and it was in the Australian and International Journal of Rural Education. And I was like, urban normative conceptions of higher education. It kind of blew my mind, you know? I thought, wow, now that's totally a concept worth discussing. He's written on the book. He wrote a book called Thinking About Teaching, Social Studies Teacher's Path to Strive for Relevance. And now he's working on a new book, Rural Education History with Lexington. Casey Jakubowski from University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. Welcome to the Annex.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. I want to share with you all that I started my life in a preparation program that was designed for suburban and urban, and they wound up rural, and my eyes were opened. And I became a rural scholar because I love to tell the stories of folks who aren't told. And I think it's important that we also identify where we've got a lot of systems and structural issues. And so I'm a big fan of the urban normative model as a way to go, yeah, no, we're way too metrocentric. So that's a little bit about me.
All right, we're going to delve into it. And along with Casey, we have Chea Lynn Parton, an English education scholar who runs a really interesting online project called Literacy in Place. And she's working on a new book, Country Teachers in City Schools, The Challenge of Navigating Identity in Place with Lexington. Chea, welcome to the Annex.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and excited to chat with both of y'all.
Yeah, it's really great to talk to all of you. You know, I've spent my entire career teaching in urban universities. And, you know, this concept of urban normativity hit home. Because, I mean, obviously we would have blinders, and there was obviously things, you know, that I have not been exposed to and haven't learned about. And so I'm looking forward to seeing, you know, talking to people who have my job just in a radically different concept. So I want to start off with a question. Like, isn't it all the same? Somebody might ask, like, is there really a difference between teaching an urban student or a suburban student and rural students? Let's start off with Chea on this one. Chea, is there really a difference?
Yeah. In short, yeah, there sure is. So what we have to think about is the way that place informs our identities and who we become as people, the way that we read, as Paulo Freire would say, the word and the world, because where we're from helps us become who we are, and who we are shapes the way that we interact with what we read, what we write, how we read, how we write, and how we interact with other people. So when we're from different places, like, you know, we had a drive your tractor to school day. I had an urban teacher who came to teach at my rural school who called the cops when the farmers were harvesting the field near her house at dark, like after it got dark, because she thought it was a UFO. And we all laughed at her and thought she was ridiculous. A lot of people love Charlotte's Web as a story, right? But as a kid, I knew that it was ridiculous because no farmer is going to spare Wilbur's life, because that's how they make their money and that's how they feed their own kids, right? So like all of these like cultural things connected to either agrarian living or other extraction practices like mining or, living in the desert. All of these rural and remote places have particular cultural practices associated with them. And if you don't understand them, or if you do, and then you go out into another place that doesn't practice them, communication can sometimes be difficult. But the way that we read, for me, right, because I'm English education, like text selection, how students read and connect with texts is different. The way that I would give consideration to students in terms of like giving extensions on deadlines and stuff. Like if a kid came into school and said, "Hey, Miss P, I'm sorry, my nanny goat was kidding at like 4 this morning and I was helping her give birth, like, can I get an extension on this deadline?" Like, I don't think that happens in urban schools, right? There's probably like a corollary, right? Or like, "Sorry, Miss P, I was up mucking stalls and, I dropped my homework," or like whatever, like it was early in the morning. I didn't get a chance to do this assignment. Like, I understood those things because I grew up on a farm and because I was a rural person. And so like my relationships that I could build with my students in my rural school was different than the other like urban folks who came in for a bit and then usually left. And there were only 4 teachers in my department for grades 7 through 12. So my mentor, we were all early career teachers too. Like the department head had like 4 years of experience, which I don't think is also something that you're going to find in an urban schooling environment. And so my mentor was the FACS teacher, the family consumer sciences teacher. And she once told me that I was faring so much better than a lot of the other teachers who had been teaching in my classroom because students couldn't smell city on me. And so like that, the way that we build relationships with students, the way that we relate and understand the experience of students in our community, those are all going to be different. And because those are different, the way that we teach then is inherently different. Whether we think it needs to be or not, it's going to be. And so we have to be really thoughtful about that in order to get students to enjoy learning and to appreciate what it is that we have to teach them. So yeah, I think it's incredibly different. I want to tell one more story, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
I teach through story.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a tiny town of 800 people. My mom and dad are from a neighboring town that's a little bit bigger, but still super small. And when I moved down to UT Austin, first of all, I didn't do very well. Like I got a house. I rented a house that I thought was going to be like a half an hour away from the city. No, it was like an hour and a half to 2 hours because traffic in the country is like, you're behind a combine or somebody's hauling anhydrous kind of slow. And like you just wait and you wait for them to get to their field and, like you're good to go. Traffic in Austin is not like that, right? I was late to everything because I didn't know how to budget time. I didn't know how to park. Right. I didn't know how to pay for parking. I didn't know where to park. I would avoid going out with friends if I didn't know where to park, because even if you go to the mall in the city of Muncie, Indiana, which is like the biggest town close to where I live, there's plenty of spaces. Even on like Black Friday, Christmas rush, you're always going to find a place to park. But anyway, so my daddy comes down to visit me because we're huge singer-songwriter fans, especially Texas singer-songwriters, grew up on Austin city limits, super excited to be in Austin. And we wanted to go to the Texas Chili Parlor because Guy Clark has a song called Dublin Blues where he goes to the Chili Parlor bar and has a Mad Dog margarita, not caring where you are, right? So we wanted to go there. My daddy has a bad hip. So we were kind of stopping frequently to rest, but there's a lot of construction all the time in Austin. It's, warm all the time. So there's just always stuff going on. So he needed to sit down and he saw this fella on a bench and he goes over, but the guy was like taking up the whole bench. And dad says to him, "Excuse me, sir, can I be your friend?" And the guy looks up at him with eyes big as silver dollars and says, "What exactly do you mean by that?" And daddy looked at me like, "Why is this man being so mean to me?" And I was like, "I'm sorry, sir. He didn't mean nothing by it. He just has a bad hip and he needs to sit down." So when we resumed our walk to the Texas Chili Parlor, he was asking me about it. Like, why was that guy so mean to me? And I was like, Dad, this is Austin. The city's like slogan is keep Austin weird. The population here is different than the population in Tipton, Indiana. Like, he needed to know what you meant by that, because you're a big dude and that can be scary, in certain situations.
Well, it's also, it can mean a bunch of things. It's like, are you propositioning me? Are you like, what's exactly happening here?
Exactly. Are you asking me for money? Like, what's, but if he would have said that to somebody in Tipton, Indiana, the guy, would have replied something like, yeah, Sonny, looks like you got a little bit of a hitch in your giddy up. Come on over and sit down and let's have a chat. We would have talked. We would have discovered we were distantly related somehow. And then we would talk about the family reunion. We go on about our way and everything would be fine. But because we were in a city, because I imagine in New York, if you said to somebody sitting down on a bench, hey, sir, can I be your friend? The response is likely going to be similar. Like, what the hell do you mean by that? Right. So places, suburban, urban, rural, they cultivate different cultural practices, and those practices don't always translate, and they inherently affect students and teachers coming into the space of a classroom. So the way that we need to teach in different places is going to be different.
Casey, what's your take?
So I love what Dr. Parton just said, and I really want to enroll in her course, because I think it's critical for us to honor the fact that you see one rural area, you've seen one rural area. And a lot of the work that we talk about in the Journal of Research on Rural Education, or the Rural Educator, really goes back to what Greenwood said, which is place-based is critical. Place-based is important. For instance, when Chea mentioned New York, I put my hand up and I went, depends on which part of New York, because believe it or not, 40% of New York is actually rural. Okay. I'm a suburban kid. I grew up just outside of the Buffalo Bills Stadium in Orchard Park, and I grew up in Burbia. I went to a Burbia school that was rural situated, but definitely not rural serving. And I actually wrote a little bit, because Dr. Parton's an amazing person and let me do that, where I talked about the fact that a lot of our institutions are rural situated, but they're like, ooh, yeah, just ignore the smell of the farm in the morning and we'll get you back to suburbia. The second area that I think about, and this is really crucial, is that I had culture shock, because my dad grew up on a farm. My grandmother used to be able to, how do I put this delicately? Use the entire hog from snout to tail. And my mom grew up in South Buffalo, very city, and she did not want to know how those spare ribs came to be, especially because they may have been named Wilbur along the way. The other point that I think is really important is my first year teaching in rural America. I saw they were trying to spend both sides of a dollar and get change back with the amazing work that they were doing. Everybody was doing 9 and 12 and 14 jobs. And when I went through my teacher prep program, they said to us, oh yeah, you need to learn how to teach social studies. And then I taught everything 7 through 12 my first year with a partner, and I was department chair because I got hired 3 days before he did. I was a 22-year-old kid out of college. I had 0 years of experience. My thought was, eek, how is this going to work? And then I went to a new community, and there were 5 of us to teach 25 different courses, because the state of New York said your kids have to have a minimum of 9th grade social studies, 10th grade social studies, 11th grade social studies, 2 different courses half year at 12th grade. And oh, by the way, if they're going to be competitive to go to college, you need to offer at least 1 or 3 other alternatives. And I thought, I was amazed with the dissonance between suburbia and urbia. And we talk about how teachers get burnt out. I was one of those 5 years and got burned out casualties. And so my colleagues and I wrote a great book called Crush It from the Start, 50 Tips for New Teachers, because one of the points that never really got talked about was the fact that in rural America, all those schools were losing teachers. And they were losing them not necessarily because of money, but because they could go from teaching 5 different classes. Most suburban folks, they're like, yeah, I go and I teach 9th grade US, 10th grade US, and I'm good. I had the whole thing. The second aspect that I want to bring up is one rural place is very unique to its own rural place. I have the extreme fortune of having worked in upstate New York, which is defined as anything north of I-84. And if you can get a good bagel, you are still not quite in this. You're still not quite downstate. You're upstate.
I'm understanding that. That's now you're phrasing things in a way I understand. Yes,
I totally get it. I moved down to rural Eastern Shore, Maryland. It's rural, but here's the difference. I was not prepared because I was used to rural defined by mountains. Down here, this is rural defined by tracks and tracks and tracks and tracks of water. You know, whoa. One rural place is one rural place. And I think, Chea, if I'm wrong, please tell me to be quiet. But I truly believe that if the national media outlets would get their heads together, they need to stop saying rural is and not saying the word unique, because they're trying to glomp everybody together. That's not good for anybody. We got to respect individuality and the uniqueness of every place.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I think that, I mean, even for me, I grew up in a rural community and I went to a rural school that was like 45 minutes away from the school that I taught at. And even then, just that amount of distance, like Pinedo, Indiana is not Gaston, Indiana, and they're both agrarian, and it's both mostly corn and soybeans and hogs and cattle. There were more dairy farms near Pinedo, but the culture of every rural place, every rural town or village or whatever is going to be different. And I think that this is something that even rural people still have trouble with, because there's this dominant narrative of like all rural places are the same. And this sort of monolithization, like making a monolith, right, out of rural places, where the story is that all rural places are white, conservative, heteronormative, homophobic, racist places where people just stand on their lawns and holler, "Let's go Brandon," while waving bad flags and doing other bad things, and like, that's not necessarily true. Like, there are those people, of course, but there are also those people in urban areas too. Like one of my favorite writers, who's also a Hoosier, she's also from Indiana, says that ignorance doesn't have a zip code. Like, it exists everywhere. And so, and that applies to people who come from rural areas. So when I came to Austin and I was thinking about doing my dissertation on rural places, I was going to this herpetology expo, because we like reptiles in this house. And we were driving through all of these rural like school zones to get to this place. And because I was thinking about partnering with rural schools, I was like looking up the demographics. And I'm expecting to find demographics that were similar to the rural school that I went to and the rural school where I taught. But here, all of the rural schools are like majority Hispanic serving places. And I was like, duh, Chea, like, I mean, how could you, like, why did you think it was going to be different? Well, because we're all sort of like egotistical and like, we think that our experience is the experience, right? But I was wrong. And the idea that like the rural South is 100% white is ridiculous. It's just like, it's the most ludicrous thing, but people still think it. And so we are capable of complexity and nuance as human beings. We are. The trouble is that it's harder. And so because we want everything to be easy, it's just easier to say that we keep telling the story of rural people as, those people on their lawns waving bad flags and doing other bad things. And so we continue to sell that story because it does sell. It, like people make money off of things like Swamp People and Duck Dynasty. And, I don't know how much money Deliverance made, but it's still a pretty, when somebody strums dueling banjos, people know,
Yeah.
and so those are lasting, right? Those are lasting and they stick around. The Beverly Hillbillies sticks around, and that was even kind of like a more positive take on rural people and their sort of silliness of not understanding, like what it is to live in a populated place. So I think you're 100% right, Casey. I think that we need to recognize that there's nuance and complexity, not only across urban, suburban, and rural places, but also, within and across rural places. Like the Sonoran Desert, like I was talking about before, is rural, but it is not the same rural that I grew up in.
Mhm.
And it is not the same rural as like the Pacific Northwest rural is rural, or like Montana, which is rural plus remote. Like remote is always rural, but rural isn't always remote, right? So like sort of like teasing out those differences and coming to a more complex understanding of how cultures get developed there, what those practices look like, and then how we can address those in schools, I think is essential. It's crucial.
And especially when we don't have good internet service in many communities, because, we talk about rural broadband, we talk about all of the different needs for that. But I want to take a step back for a second and talk about just sources of information. Joe's in, if I can call you that, you're in New York City. You've got the New York Times, you've got all these different newspapers. In some of the areas that Chea and I are working in, we're lucky if we have a newspaper. And often, and especially this is something that tears my heart in half, is that the majority of the content in the newspaper is only accessible online, or it's just reprints from one of the big USA Today services, because we're not investing in giving people opportunity to get into different media sources. I talk about, I know I'm in a rural area when the NPR station is the college's station. I also am really amazed at how the radio portrays different music. I was shocked because living in Buffalo, New York, and then going to where I was teaching in rural Delaware County, Katy Perry's California Girls, Snoop Dogg was completely censored from it. Yet, and I was in Buffalo, it was like, Snoop's got a track, man. But, I get down to Delaware County and it's just Katy Perry. And I'm thinking, this is not good, especially in communities where we have different demographics that they're not hearing or seeing others. The last part I want to share, and I think this is also something that really we're doing a disservice to and of, is we think rural's extraction industry. And yet when we look at the demographics, yeah, there is extraction. It's like 20%, if that, of the community. It's services. So we have rural nurses, we have rural teachers, we have rural professionals who are doing yo person's work. And Kathy Kramer said it best. A lot of times rural folks are like, what the heck's going on in the city and the capital? Not because they want to be jerks about it or they want to wave that bad flag, but they're like, what about us? And I think one of the areas is that this is not selfish. It's not self-serving. I think what it is it's a legitimate concern. And in some of the research that I found, the New York State government said to a rural community in the 1940s, hey, we really don't like the communist central planning model and we want everybody to have their say in the world. So shut up and merge. And the response from the rural community was, this is not making sense. There is dissonance. How come we can't vote? How come we can't have our say? And the response from the state education department was, you don't know what you're doing. So this idea that we de-skill people who have lived lives, to me, is where we're blowing the whole thing up. That's what I want to say.
I want to get to the politics of funding rural stuff a little later, but first I want to just nail down, just this basic concept. So what I'm gathering from you guys is that, in education, we talk a lot about cultural sensitivity on race, ethnicity. We talk about it on gender. We talk about being culturally sensitive in terms of sexuality. And what I'm hearing from you is that rural students also deserve that type of consideration. They come from a cultural milieu that is different from the predominant student, but they're ignored as a class that needs to be served. And what I'm understanding is that rural students might require that the same type of sensitivity that we would apply to other types of students who we imagine are engaged in a type of cross-cultural interaction when they come to university. Am I understanding, the basic thrust of that correctly?
Yes, and it's incredibly difficult to do because teachers are trying to do it while using educational theory that has been developed by urban people. I'm actually just getting ready to give a talk about this as a keynote at the Kansas State Rural Summit on April 6th.
We're going to talk about that. I want to talk about that.
Okay, so like a preview sneak peek of what I'm going to talk about. What I found in my dissertation research is that the teachers that I were working with identified as like culturally sustaining teachers, but they're working in these urban schools where there are urban and rural students in the same school, because it's like, on the fringe of where urban sprawl is like making its way into the rural area. And they're only using like culturally sustaining pedagogy and pedagogical principles that were developed by Django Paris and Samuel Leem, which came out of an urban area, right? Like, and they're talking about sustaining the cultures of urban, brown and Black folks, people of color, right? And those people exist in rural places too, but even within their own framework, thinking about diverse cultures is thinking about urban diverse cultures and not thinking about rural diverse cultures. And so these teachers are using the principles of culturally sustaining pedagogy to sustain cultures that do exist in their classrooms, but are doing it in a way that also ignores other students in their classroom. And the thing that like frustrates me and that I'm trying to work to remedy is that in one of the publications, Django Paris talks about how like these students have to divest themselves of their identities when they come into classrooms. And like, yes, that's true. But when you're using Paris's culturally sustaining pedagogy, and this is a loving critique because I think his work is wonderful and I think it's really important. But my loving critique is that when we use culturally sustaining pedagogy as it has been created out of urban places in rural places, we're still asking students to divest themselves of part of their identity when they walk into the classroom. And so what I'm trying to do in my work is to come up with a rural culturally sustaining pedagogy that recognizes rural cultures and helps to not sustain them statically. I think people have an issue with that term sustain. Like we're not trying to sustain them like, like a time, like a snapshot or a time capsule. Like we're not trying to keep them the same always, but we're trying to sustain them in their growth and evolution according to the values and beliefs that are essential to their history, like from their history, but also inform the progress they make as they continue to grow as a culture. And so yeah, go ahead.
What is like, what's involved in that specifically? Like when you're asking a rural student to divest themselves, like what specifically are we asking them to give up?
Okay, that's a good question. I have a good story for that too.
Right.
Okay, so
so one of the good things about an English scholar is always like they know how to tell a story.
Well, it's just how I think selfishly, it's how I learned best always. And also
it's the best.
Like it's really powerful for, like illustrating a concept. So in 6th grade, I was put in an honors English class. And it was my first time in the GT program as a middle schooler. And I had come later than most of the other students in the class, even though I had known them all from kindergarten, right? And so we're reading this book called The Forgotten Door. And I don't know if you can tell in my speech patterns, but I do less policing now of the way that I talk in academic spaces, because I understand that rural language varieties are important and that I think that they should have space in academic spaces. So anyway, we're reading The Forgotten Door. I really loved that book, really loved it. And we're talking about it. And I had something to say. And when I said it, I can't remember my point exactly, but what I do remember is that I used a double negative, and I think I used ain't. And my teacher, and bless her, she didn't mean to hurt me. I know that is true. But instead of paying attention to the idea of what I said, she paid attention to how I said it. And she corrected what I said, my grammar, and then she moved on. We didn't talk about my idea. We didn't talk about the thing that I was so excited to share. She ignored my idea to correct my grammar. And then we moved on. And all of the other kids in the class kind of snickered, even though a lot of them were growing up on farms too, and they had no right to judge me whatsoever. But, you know, Chea got in trouble with the teacher or whatever. And so I learned right there in that moment that if I was going to be taken seriously, that if people were going to listen to what I had to say, that I had to say it different. And so I started policing my language. And every time I went into a classroom, especially an English classroom, I made sure that I didn't talk country, that I didn't sound like my family, that I stopped talking like my papa, who's one of the smartest men I ever met. Because I learned that made me seem stupid. And that made my family seem stupid. So not only did I start policing my own language, but I also started policing my family's language. And to their credit, they never listened to me.
Right.
They just kept talking the way they'd always been talking. So that's one way, right?
Well,
don't talk the way that you've learned to talk, because that's not welcome here.
So it's like,
go ahead.
It's almost like what I'm understanding is that regardless of the subject that you're supposed to be trained in, the focus of the teaching was to ensure that you imitated the master culture. Exactly. And your thoughts weren't welcome. Nobody was interested in what you said until you learned to talk like the dominant culture. Is that?
Exactly. Yeah. And that has followed me my entire educational career. At UT Austin, I failed my first review as a graduate student because I'm a cooperative overlapper. So your coaching about like how to interrupt really spoke to me, because in cooperative overlapping, a lot of times you're talking over each other, and that's completely okay, because you're paying attention to what someone is saying so hard that you know what's coming next, and you either try to complete their sentence as they're saying it, or you've already moved on to the next idea because you are just like with them and tracking with them. That was not appreciated, as I'm sure you can imagine, in a graduate class, especially from a white person who read as suburban and middle class, neither of which are true. I mean, I'm middle class now, but that's not how I came up. So language practice, heavily policed. And so if you want to be seen as smart, that's something you got to leave at the door. My point about Wilbur and that story being ridiculous, also not welcome in classrooms, but as a farm kid, like it didn't make any sense to me, but that viewpoint has no place or space in the classroom. So things like that, or even my students coming in smelling like, cow manure because they've just come from their, shift on the dairy farm or whatever. Didn't bother me any, because I grew up, we'd get up in the morning and we could smell, we raised hogs. And if one of my siblings or somebody said, "Oh, it stinks outside," my stepdad or, my papa or whoever it was would say, "It smells like money." And so like, that's just something that we got used to. It's not something that bothered me, but there were other town kids in the school who would complain about stuff like that. So there's that, there's that kind of thing, how you dress, how you talk, how you behave, how you engage with academic, material. A lot of that for rural kids, even in rural schools, is asked to be left at the door. And so they don't get to come into our classrooms as whole people. Casey, I'm sorry. I know you want to talk. Go ahead, bro. I'm sorry.
No, I was loving it. I just wanted to code switch for a second. For those of you who are not aware, there is levels of manure. Cow is nice, horse is nice. You get down into like hogs and chickens, and oh dang, it stinks.
It is.
It's like really rancidly bad. But part of this, and what Chea's talking about, is the first time I experienced hunting season. Suburbanite, grew up. Dad did not grow up with guns. Mom grew up in the city, did not grow up with guns. I now have friends who I believe are doing the right thing by teaching how to use hunting weapons safely, not AK-47s, but hunting weapons safely. And I'm very proud of the fact that as an Eagle Scout, I know how to do all that. That is a rural, suburban-y type thing. But one of the areas is, I remember the first time one of the kids drove with his kill and he wanted to show his teacher. It just so happened that day kindergartners were watching Bambi. Not a good moment. But I was concerned because the first day of hunting, a lot of students were absent. And I said to the principal, I'm like, why are all these kids absent? And he said, sit down for a second. We got to orient you. We forget that in a lot of rural communities, you don't go to the supermarket when you are at the poverty or below poverty wage. You do a lot of your own raising of food. You do a lot of your own hunting. And the idea that we don't talk about just what Chea just said in schools about this is really critical. Most of our school systems are set up to provide capital, human resource capital for the urban environment. In fact, it's all across the place, cited up, down, 6 ways to 1. And a researcher just came out and said, well, you know, there's a correlation between being rural and being anti-intellectual. And my initial response was, where's this person from? Harvard? Yes. But one of the biggest points is that that is correlational data. It's not causational data. Some of the smartest people I know are rural because A, they're running multi-million-dollar businesses. Farming's not cheap, folks. It is extraordinarily expensive. B, number 2, they have had to overcome logistical issues way before COVID-19 pandemic. You know, Chea's talking about in Indiana, you got harvest, you got to get that soybean up to Chicago, or you might have to get it to China. You've got to deal with people, you've got to deal with interest rates that would boggle a mortgage owner's mind. And you also have to deal with the bureaucracy of the federal government where they're like, we're going to help you, but in reality, the help is annoying. All these things pile in on it so that when we start talking about my area, which is politics, policy, and as a recovering social studies teacher, I know about telling stories and I will tell them. What we forget is that people have had to learn how to overcome a lack of systemic support that exists in an urban environment where you can take a bus. You can't take buses in rural communities unless they are yellow and the school owns them or rents them. So one of the biggest areas was I had a kid who couldn't get to orientation at a college 32 miles away because the family didn't own a car that was safe enough to drive, A. B, it was expensive as all get out to attend the orientation, $150, but that was a lot of money for a family making $12,000 in 1995, right? And C, she said, I don't think I'm going to fit in because almost all the kids were from Long Island or the suburban Rochester or Buffalo area. And so we had to talk her off the ledge of not going to that school. And Erica Chris talks about this in some of her research. It's phenomenal. But Elizabeth Kate also talks about it when she says, what you're getting wrong about Appalachia. I think what we forget is that we forget that there are rural communities everywhere, but the systems and structures are such, especially first gens who are trying to do their thing, they're torn. Do I stay home? Do I come back? Is there a place for me to come back to? And more importantly, if I go away, am I going to hear it on the first break coming home? Because one of the things Chea talked about, and I think you're absolutely right, is this concept of policing your language or code switching. You know, I cannot tell you how many times my students, when I was teaching in Oneonta, would say to me, I'm going to go back to a place that believes that we should only care about those who want to work. And I said, but isn't that, tell me about that. And they said, well, you know, honestly, there's this narrative. Urban people don't want to work, which is false. If you look at it, one of the areas that we have to do, not only as teacher educators, but also as K-12 teachers, is we've got a dual mission. Our dual mission is how do we honor and respect our students who have outside obligations, but also they want to grow and develop into their own best life. And I think when we're talking about schools, we're talking about systems that were designed for A, a different era, B, a different community, and C, everybody from Elwood Coverly in 1914 on has said it's a rural problem. When Enzano and Biddle clearly blew that up in their phenomenal research. But we, Chea and I, when we're doing this research, we talk a lot about power structures and hidden curriculums and hidden narratives. And one of the biggest hidden narratives is everybody knows how to fill out a FAFSA in the suburban community because everybody talks about it. But in a rural community, a lot of times those schools, they are just desperately trying to keep students' body and souls together to get them to graduate. And when you have one guidance counselor for a K-12 district of 275 kids, coffee doesn't cut it after a while.
But
and I'm going to shut up.
Well, here's a question about funding better services in rural areas, because I see this theme come through. And one of the difficulties I have as an urbanite is that I understand those communities to be the ones who are most entrenched against government services and public investment and taxation. And so it's sometimes from the urban standpoint, it's hard to muster up the sympathy for cuts in investment, in communities that you perceive to be cutting those investments, or like the main constituency for cutting it. But I gotta believe on some level, I have a blindness. I have sort of an urban normative view. And so like that I'd like some pushback on. Can you push back on me with that view? Because I'm sure that it's blind to things.
So let me tell you this scenario. In the United States, the majority of our states use what's called property taxes to support local education. So I'd like for you to think about this. Most urban areas have a lot of valuation. A lot of rural areas don't have a lot of valuation. So if you raise your tax rate 1% in a rural community, you're going to get $100. You raise the tax rate 1% in a suburban community, you're going to get $10,000. And I'm just being astronomically crazy about that. But here's the other thing. So Google or Amazon wants to put one of the distribution centers in a rural community. You're going to get a 20 to 30 year pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. What that means is all the folks that are moving in, the services are going to astronomically have to increase, but they're only paying $50,000 to $100,000 when they really should owe $2 million. The other area is, let's be honest with you, part of the reason why rural communities are really concerned about taxing themselves and they set themselves up against urban communities is they keep hearing a narrative, you got to do more with less. And in urban areas, the narrative is, oh my God, we got to fix all these problems. So there's this bifurcation where the state, instead of looking at the billionaires and saying, come on, folks, pay up, or the federal government assuming more responsibility, it costs a lot of money to educate a kid. It really does. And I'm from a very high tax state of New York. Part of the problem is that we've got to stop putting urban and rural folks against each other. We have to start saying, okay, yeah, you want to keep your small school. That's great. All the research says you want to keep your small school. That's going to help you graduate. But telling people to give up in order to get a little bit more, it gets really tiresome. And I think one of the areas that a lot of rural folks and urban folks need to sit down together and start saying is, who's not paying their fair share? Because you're getting really beat up urban for your tax rate. We're getting really beat up in our area for rural tax rates. Somebody's not paying. And then the reality is that the whole system is based on land as value, and value exists because somebody says it exists. And if you have a farmhouse that is 150 years old on 100 acres, and they say you got to pay $15,000 a year in taxes, and you're like, oh God, how am I going to afford to do this, that, and the other thing? It's very familiar to a family in an urban area going, well, we're going to have to raise the tax rates. And you're like, what are we doing it for? So part of the problem is services, especially government services, are expensive. And when you don't have infrastructure that can be picked up by other groups, you're really looking for problems. And one of the reasons why a lot of those church suppers exist when they say they're raising money, yeah, but the leftovers are going to families that need it. Let's be honest with you. There is a lot of community engagement where you know your neighbors and you really want to make sure they don't starve. So that's why stuff magically appears on people's driveways. And Chea's going to hit me over the head.
I want to turn to Chea on this, but the one thing that I have is, I'm in Canada, I'm from a poorer region, Northern Ontario, and the politics are, almost socialist, because there's a sense that our community is poor and redistribution brings wealth into our poor community to buy us better things than we can afford. And so, and I feel like the logic of non-urban areas, it's like the opposite logic occurs here in the United States, where, because my understanding is most of the money comes from very wealthy people, like the overwhelming amount comes from high income earners in urban and suburban areas. But Chea, go ahead. I got excited there.
So from my perspective, I think it has a lot to do with identity. Okay, so who was the last rural president?
I don't even know.
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter. What is the representation of rural people in government like? Like, how many rural people are in government?
I would imagine it's disproportionate to, isn't it? Like, to the population.
So there are. So when we think about representation, right? Rural communities are really used to people coming into their communities and saying, hey, I'm going to pay you for your minerals. And then just taking the tops off of mountains so that huge floods happen and mudslides happen all the time and people are dying and losing their homes and nobody's replacing them because they didn't have insurance, because they can't afford it, because they're working for a miner who isn't paying them shit, right? Because they pay them these little tickets that they get to go into the store that's owned by the miner. And this is what we're used to, right? We're used to people who are big highfalutin city folks coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to pay you for your resources, and then just getting shit all over, right? Like the East Palestine train wreck. Where did that happen? Ohio, rural Appalachian Ohio, right? And so like when you're used to people saying, hey, this makes more sense to do it this way, or, like it makes more sense to think about it this way. First of all, at least in my family and pretty much all the rural folks that I know from where I'm from, we don't want to listen to anything that these people in government have to say because they're all from cities. And so what do they know about our experiences in the first place? And the last person we listened to who was from a city who told us they were going to do something good for us, or they had a good idea, really, really screwed us over. So why would we listen to that? Why would we not say, actually, we need to do the opposite of what you're saying, because obviously you're trying to screw us somehow. You just dumped toxic waste in my backyard and told me you'd pay me $5 for every head that lives in this town, when there's a lady whose entire flock of chickens died from it 10 miles away from the dump site, right? Like, that's why rural people don't want to listen to policies
Right.
that seem like government involvement and is a little more socialist, because we've been exploited and extorted our entire existences. But it hasn't been that way throughout history. So like the term redneck comes from people who were trying to start unions, right? Who were trying to bust the hold that the mines had on them and stuff like that. That term wasn't always derogatory. It was something important, and it was people. And again, not all people who live in rural areas feel that way. Right. And the reporting that gets done is not fair. So in Appalachian Reckoning, a book that came out of the West Virginia University Press, that was kind of a response to J.D. Vance's extremely offensive book, Hillbilly Elegy.
Wow, were you polite? I would have called it a pile of crap.
It is. Me. Especially because the community that he relied on to get all of the money from that publication, he's now essentially disowned so that he can be some, Ohio senator or whatever the hell. But anyway, so there are, so in the Appalachian Reckoning, there is a scholar, and I can't remember their name right now, who talks about like there was a reporter that was in town to report on a rural rally for Bernie Sanders, right? And instead of, yes, such a good book. But instead of reporting on that, they reported on something totally different that had to do with like people supporting Trump. Even though there were people who marched in protest at the inauguration, there are people who marched and were against like, the January 6th insurrection. There are rural people who have supported Bernie Sanders, who have supported more socialist policies, but nobody pays attention to those people because it's not the convenient narrative, and it's not what we want. It's not the story we want to tell, that urban normative folks and society writ large want to tell about rural people, because it's easier to make a mockery of them and to make them sort of like into a whipping boy, where we can like say and to say, hey, they've done it to themselves. Look who they voted for, which there's a ton of issues with that too. But essentially we just end up blaming the victim. And for me and my family, I think that a lot of the issue comes down to, which I'm not particularly red, and sometimes that causes a lot of issues in family discussions at Thanksgiving. But from the discussions that I've had with my family, what I gather is they're sick of not being represented by people who understand their situations in government. They're sick of not having people who aren't going to take from them and just continue to take and take and take the way that historically they've been taken from. And I think that, paired with all of the other sort of like money, nuts and bolts things that aren't exactly my specialty, I think that those two things combined are the reason why we continue to see more rural red or purple areas than blue areas.
Yeah, it sounds.
And I just wanted to add something to that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the points is we talk a lot about cracking districts in redistricting, about cities being divided up, and rural areas, or it's It's actually the suburbanites, because if you look at it, most rural communities are included as appendages to urban areas. So when former Governor Cuomo in New York released a plan to drive economic development in New York, one of the things you saw was that they were centered on cities, and the quote rural hinterlands were part of it. You look at the newly re-identified congressional districts in New York. The district that my parents live in suburban Orchard Park, actually stretches all the way out to Ithaca, New York. That's 150 miles. And part of the reason why was because politics. But what we're really not talking about is the suburban problem that this country is facing in terms of the suburbanites are really the ones that we need to talk about. Most of the folks who were arrested in the January 6 insurrections, suburbanites. Most of the people who talk about they don't want their children exposed to those type of books, so let's ban critical race theory. Those are suburbanites. So I think one of the areas that we really have to talk about is the fact that suburbanization has resulted in increased segregation in the country. And to your east, Professor Cohen, there is a small little community called Hempstead. Hempstead does not look like Glen Cove or Grove City at all. In fact, there is another community called Wyandanch, looks absolutely nothing like the North Shore. It's suburbanite. We also need to talk about the fact that in rural and suburban areas, a lot of times people, they don't know their neighbors anymore. And that's because we've created a society of anonymity, and we've created a society where we don't talk as people. And one of the points that I've raised in some of my research is that urban communities and rural communities actually have a lot more in common. And one of the areas is that they are getting stereotypicalized, if I can use that mishigash, into places where, urban problems in education, rural problems in education. But at the same point in time, if you look at the statistics, they're doing miracles because of high poverty and situationals where the narrative is you're failing. Remember, No Child Left Behind in 2000 essentially said to schools, we're going to assume you're failing. Prove us wrong. That's never happened before in American history. And I also just want to mention something about our Canadian neighbors. You guys are phenomenal, and you've done a really good job of not making the concept, as Cam Scribner talks about in his book, Local Control, or The Fight for Local Control. The narrative in your country is don't lie on the media. You will get in trouble. Whereas the United States, the narrative hasn't always been that way because, let's face it, we don't like regulation in this country.
I'm getting the sense from this discussion that part of the problem is sort of like a cultural polarization where it's almost like the urban identity has come to be spoiled in the minds of the urbanite, and the urbanite identity has come to be spoiled in the minds of rural America, to the point where you don't want to even hear, or there are people who don't even want to hear. So if an urbanite says, rail regulation would, regulating safety on rail could help prevent a spill in East Palestine, Ohio, people will see the urbanite and be like, well, the last time an urbanite came by to tell us to explode a mountain, it was bad. So probably regulation is bad. And it's like much in the same way that people wouldn't listen to the substance of your rural story. It's like you don't care about what the substance of what the person is saying. The mere fact that it's coming out of the mouth of somebody whose identity has been spoiled in your social media almost turns off conversation. Am I feeling it right? Do you agree with that basic sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we find it hard to listen to one another. There's even there's an Instagram account called I think like Braver Angels, where they talk about like how to have conversations against political divides, because we've somehow lost that ability. Because as soon as somebody who you assume is going to disagree with you starts talking, you check out, or you keep thinking of like, okay, how am I going to argue with them next, instead of like actually listening to what they're saying. I don't think we have conversations to understand one another. I think we just have conversations to fight.
But not across the political divide, right? The urban-rural divide. It's just,
but I feel like there's a conflation, right?
The
assumption is that all rural America is conservative, and that's not true. And the assumption is that all urban America is liberal, and that's also not true.
Yeah, that was. Go ahead, Casey.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, we have the regulations. My dad used to work on a railroad. The regulations exist. The problem is the enforcement agencies were destroyed, and part of the issue is, if you talk to somebody in a rural community about the environment, you talk to somebody in an urban community about the environment, they will say the exact same thing differently. They both want healthy, safe environments for their children. The way we get to it, though, is different. So sometimes the journey is a problem. And the second point is, I don't think it's political. I don't think it's rural versus urban. I think it's the elite wealthy versus everybody else. Because we don't talk about Marxism, because Marxism is bad. And we don't talk about social economic situations, because the narrative is, if you work hard enough, you will always succeed. Well, how in the hell can you do that in my community when the local chicken processing plant's only paying $15 an hour to kill the damn chickens? How do you do that in a community where you tell somebody, oh, you didn't take advanced placement? We're not going to let you into a state college. And oh, by the way, we're going to make it so expensive that a TV to put on your wall that's high def is going to be like $100, but to get a degree, it's going to be $250,000 or more. And the other area is that we don't do a good enough job of understanding, especially academics who as a group are always situated but never engaged. We talk to each other, but I'll tell you this, my journal articles and the one you talked about that really caught your eye, I think maybe 75 people to 100 have read it. But
that's par for the course in this business, though, in all fairness.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is I have yet to be able to get a letter to the editor in a newspaper where I talk about, rural folks don't, I have this conversation with my friend who is a Second Amendment advocate. And when the last school shooting happened, his wife and his kids are in school. I said, buddy, what's the problem with a background check for you? He said, oh, it's a pain in the ass. I said, yeah, but do you want to make sure your wife and your kids are safe? And he said, but why the hell does the government have to tell me? And I said, because you're not the problem. You're inconvenienced. There's a difference between an inconvenience and people being scared for their lives. A rifle in a rural area is something to use to defend your family against a wolf or a bear. And I've got friends in northern New York. They get brown bears a lot. And coming from Canada, if a white, what are they called? Oh my God.
I'm nowhere near polar bears.
Yeah, polar bear. If a polar bear shows up, it's all over, right? But, you use a weapon in a rural area as a tool. In an urban area, the only reason you need a weapon is because you want to do something bad or you're trying to stop people from doing something bad. Totally different lived experiences. Let's call the reality the reality. We have a crisis of understanding because, as Chea so eloquently put, we don't want to talk to each other. We want to yell at each other. And we got to stop yelling at each other, because my hackles are up. I'm going to defend my rural people, but I'm also going to defend the rights of my suburban friends. And I'm also going to do that for the urban people as well. What we have is we have a system that is internally colonizing folks who are not the wealthiest. who are not the powerful. And we've taken away their ability to say, this doesn't feel right. If you look at it, what's the biggest issues with insurance companies? I've experienced 3 times insurance companies not paying claims. Urban and rural and suburban folks are all going, why the hell do I need to pay something when they're not going to pay me for what they're supposed to pay me for? That is the mindset that we have to say is, why are we allowing people to get away with illegalities? And I was told by a lawyer, sorry, it's in the law, it's written that way. I don't know about you, but I have a PhD and I can't read I cannot understand 3/4 of the legal notifications I get from a bank or something else. I've got a doctorate. I'm smart. I can't even imagine somebody who got through high school by the skin of their teeth, yet run a multi-million-dollar agency, their tractor breaks down. No wonder why they want to be able to fix it, because they can't spend $750,000 taking it to the only authorized dealer who's 800 miles away. Sorry about that, Joe.
Yeah. All right. Well, you know what? We are actually at it now. This went very, very fast. And it's about as far as I can go before my producers start getting mad because they have to edit this. So we're capped at an hour. But I want to end. Oh, wait, there's 2 things that I want. Number one, very quickly, can you tell us very quickly about your books? I wanted to preview your books. If anybody's interested in this urban rural divide and teaching rural students. Tell us about your books. Casey, do you want to start off? Tell us about your book coming out in the Lexington series.
I'm so proud of the fact that the 3 books that I have coming out now are all practitioner based, all address recruitment and retention. Thinking about teaching, Cog in the Machine, 50 Tips for a New Teacher, Hearts, which is about integrating science and humanities with a history focus. The next one, the big person book, the one that I have coming out that's academic, is called Rural Education History. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to talk about the fact of the matter is the narratives existed for over 100 years. It's not that rural people are angry. It's they have a right to be angry. Because again, as we've talked about here, stuff has been done to them. Their rights as citizens have been ignored. And it's not that they're trying to do anything wrong. They just really want people to go, hey, you matter. That's my book. But everybody, buy Dr. Parton's. Oh my gosh, that is the best book I've ever seen.
Tell us about your book coming out.
So my book is called Country Teachers in City Schools, the challenge of negotiating identity and place, or place and identity. I don't know. I can't remember. It's both of them. I'm talking about both.
We generally don't write our titles. Anybody who is not writing books don't always write.
I do like my title though.
Yeah.
But yeah, so mine sort of details what I learned from a study working with 7 rural outmigrant teachers. So an outmigrant is someone who grew up rurally raised and then moved, as you have to, if you want to go to a university, usually you have to leave your community, whether you want to or not. And then if you fully outmigrate, you don't return, right? You stay and you settle in like a suburban area or an urban area. So the teachers that we're working with were outmigrants, and I look at how language, landscape, and place are like geospatial considerations of place and the interactions that happen in there, help them develop their personal and professional identities. And then I talk about how that makes it into their practices in their classrooms.
Very nice. And wait, and one last thing before we go. So to our listeners who are academics and probably have rural students in their classrooms, could you leave us off with maybe a final thought, something that you'd like us to take home when thinking about rural students and how we can do good by them, especially for the people like me who are very ignorant, and probably are guilty of half of the the prejudices or narrow-minded ideas that, we're all vulnerable to. Leave us off with something, a piece of a food for thought or inspiration. Casey, you want to go first?
Rule number one, recruit rural. Even if you're in an urban community, go out, find people who deserve the opportunity to attend school and scholarship the heck out of them. Do not make it that they come to your school and you have to see them struggle because they have to work. The other area I want to share with you is this. Find a rural teacher, give them an award, give them resources, write grants with rural communities to help get them money, because they will be able to spend both sides of that dollar and give you 50 cents back.
All right, Chea.
For me, it is recognize that rural people have funds of knowledge that matter. And when they come into your classroom, allow them to bring those with them. And instead of looking for the lack and instead of looking for the deficit, because you'll always find one, look for the asset and use that to build on. In terms of whatever your content area, whatever your specialty is, whatever you're teaching, find out what it is that your kids already know, or your students, if you're a university setting, find out what it is that they already know and use that to build on. And I think that's it. I had a second thing, but I can't think of it now.
You know what it reminds me of? There was a line in The Stand, not the new one, but the 1980s one. And I think it was Gary Sinise. And I remember we watched this and he was like, country don't mean dumb. And, that's profound in a way. I think that there might be some automatic presumptions, the same type of prejudices that people might have extended to other types of minorities, sexual minorities, racial ethnic minorities, and females who are a majority, but are at a structurally distant. But it might be that, we have to apply that type of, reflexivity and self-awareness to this group as well.
Oh, I remember my second thing.
Go. Yes.
Let rural people see themselves in your curriculum.
Okay. Yeah.
Let rural people see themselves represented in whatever it is that you teach, because we have contributed to society time and time over and again. And almost every single book I ever read, if there were rural people, they were pathologized, and rural was something to be cured or fixed. But let your students see themselves honored and acknowledged in your curriculum. Doesn't mean it has to be rose-colored glasses, because I'm not saying there aren't, problems in rural places, because Lord knows there is, because there is everywhere. But let your rural students see themselves honored and represented in your
like three-dimensional people.
Yeah. It's amazing how that. Yeah.
Ask your librarian for help. We all know how to do a literature review. Go to the library and say, hey, I want to assign a book, but the only one that I keep seeing is this book on J.D. Vance's. No, go deeper than that. Use the Journal of Research for Rural Education or the Rural Educator. Ask your librarian to give you something that is powerful. Go to Appalachian Studies. Go to Dr. Parton's talk, for goodness sakes. Make sure you do the work you know how to do. And if you don't want to do the work, find a grad student who will do the work for you, or assign a special project to an undergrad. Get the stuff that's out there. It's all out there.
Final plug. Professor Parton will be at the Rural Education Summit coming up on April 6th. We'll put a link to it in the show page. Casey Jakubowski from the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, and Chea Lynn Parton from Purdue University. Thank you very much for visiting us and teaching us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I think Casey, you were muted.
Our pleasure.
You've been listening to the Annex, a sociology podcast. The Annex is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. You can learn more about the podcast by visiting us online, theannexpodcast.com. And to learn more about the Queen's Podcast Lab, pay us a visit at queenspodcastlab.org. My name is Joe Cohen. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.